You're listening to Honestly Aging by VigRHealth, a podcast where we explore what it's like getting older, the peaks, the valleys, and everything in between. In this season of Honestly Aging by VigRHealth, we're covering topics related to solo aging. I'm your host, Cheryl Proska. Let's grow old together. On today's episode, I'm joined by Katie Reilly. Katie is a doctoral level gerontologist with over 13 years of experience in the senior care industry. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Gwynedd Mercy University, a master's degree in gerontology from St. Joseph's University, and a PhD from Concordia University in leadership and gerontology with a qualitative research focus on the existence of ageism. Katie works as a care advisor for the Abramson Senior Care Healthy Brain and Memory Center. Additionally, Katie provides education on dementia-related topics to both formal and informal caregivers, as well as the community at large. Katie also serves as a volunteer for the Alzheimer's Association as both a support group facilitator and certified community educator. In addition to her work at Abramson Senior Care, Katie works as an adjunct professor at a local university teaching undergraduate courses on aging and dementia. Katie, welcome. Thank you for being here. How are you?
Thank you so much, Cheryl. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful.
Yeah.
So, Katie, you're joining me today to discuss ageism and its impact on today's society. Throughout our conversation, we are going to define ageism, cover the negative repercussions ageism can have, strategies to combat it, and more. But before we get into all that, I would love to know where your interest in ageism comes from and how it led to your doctoral dissertation.
Yes, that's such a great question. And I'm so glad to be here with you this morning talking about this topic of ageism because it really is such a passion for me. I've been working as a gerontologist for, as you said, over 13 years. And a lot of my career has been spent in senior living. And I think that's where I initially just saw, subtleties of ageism kind of embedded in these community cultures, thinking residents may not hear or understand because they were of an older age, limiting decision-making, even what we call, that elder speak, that baby talk, just some subtle instances of ageism that I would see among staff, even among residents. So I think that's really where I first was like, this is something not good. And then I think, on a personal note, just a number of times that I am asked, why I would choose or would want to work with older people is sort of a subtlety of ageism there, because every time I'm asked that question, it's always kind of with this tone of like disbelief or shock or just kind of like, why would you want to work with older people? And to me, that's a little bit ageist. Towards older individuals. So that was sort of where it stemmed from. I think my doctoral coursework really further propelled this passion because I started learning, of course, as we know, about population aging and the increase and influx of older people, and well as just, the repercussions of ageism on health and well-being. So I think, all of that kind of coupled together has certainly fostered this passion. And I'm so glad to be able to talk about it here on this podcast. I think that's a big piece is the recognition of it. So. Yeah.
That's so interesting to me because when I tell people what I do, and I work for a nonprofit Quaker organization that focuses on aging services, I get a lot of feedback where people are like, wow, you can actually feel good about what you're doing. And I can. And I've always been just very drawn to the aging population, have a great relationship with my grandparents, and that I just feel like it's such a great fit for me. And it's so nice to be able to connect with other people in the industry who just have like share the same type of passion.
I agree too. I love that. I had a similar experience growing up with a very close relationship with my grandmother. And I'll talk about that later, that importance of intergenerational connection. But I love being able to connect with people because I think we're a little bit of a minority, people that love older people and aging and just find it so fulfilling and meaningful. And that's, I know it's my life's work is to be working with older people and with them and on their behalf. So I feel the same way. It's fantastic.
Katie, can you tell us all, to get us set up for the rest of the episode, what is ageism?
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start, that foundational knowledge. And really, ageism is discrimination against anyone based upon their chronological age. So I think it is important to note that we can see ageism towards younger cohorts. We can often call that reverse ageism. So it really is discrimination against anyone based upon age, but we see this most frequently towards older adults, which I think is why it's such an epidemic, because we have so many aging cohorts, just an increase there. Yeah.
Are there any components of ageism or examples that you can give us?
Mm-hmm. So we really see three main components that kind of comprise the definition of ageism. And the first one is prejudicial attitudes. And that can be, feelings or beliefs like all older adults are set in their ways, or older people are just stubborn, or, you reach the age of 70 and you just lose your memory and you develop dementia, or, simply not liking someone because of their advanced age. That descriptions or examples of that component. Then we see discriminatory practices as that second component. And that's, passing someone over for a promotion because of their age, or maybe not considering them for a medical procedure because they're quote unquote too old. And then thirdly, we see institutional practices, and that would be something like mandatory or forced retirement. So those are really the three components that comprise the definition of ageism towards older people. And I think we see this ageism so much more frequently in Western parts of the world, such as the United States, where there is this undertone where older adults are maybe less valued or less considered or less respected by society at large.
And you brought up a term to me that, not that it's new, but I never looked at it this way, with the chronological ageism, because that's what we're talking about here today. However, I completely understand what you're saying, because there is that reverse ageism that can be toward the younger population. Mm-hmm. And it just makes me wonder, when people, when they start making that switch of that, when do we start considering the discrimination that is put upon people who are getting older? And I've read that for women in the workplace, it can start in the late 30s, early 40s. So it's something on my mind.
Oh, for sure. And I almost think it's evolving too, because I think what constitutes old age is always evolving. I mean, what used to be 70, I think used to be considered, oh my gosh, that's so old. Now 70 is like, oh my gosh, you're only 70. So I think it can really be evolving there too, of what, delineates old age. When does that switch happen? But yeah, I think there's, reverse ageism where older people may have bias, of course, towards younger cohorts. It definitely can go both ways, which I wanted to note that is the case.
Yeah, I thought that was important too.
Agreed. Yeah.
So why is it so important that we talk about and we recognize ageism?
So I think for several reasons. I think, first and primarily, it's because it's discrimination against a group of people. I think, two, because there's so many more older people. There's such an influx of population aging, as I mentioned earlier. So there's just such an increased potential for more and more prevalence. And I think, because of that increased prevalence, it really can emerge as, a bit of a public health issue that's in fact impacting, physical health, emotional and mental health and well-being, and just quality of life of larger and larger groups of older people. So I think it really brings it to the forefront. Like, we have to be talking about this, and we have to be recognizing it, and like, how do we in turn really help eradicate it and help just like change the tide of what, ageism is doing to older people.
In some of the work I'm doing in my organization and in my studies is in learning more about implicit and explicit bias. Do we see this with the aging population?
Absolutely. So we certainly see both types there. That's a great question. I mean, explicitly, that element of blatancy is really there, where you may not hire an older adult because of their age. I think this form can be seen as more hurtful because it can be perceived as deliberate. But implicitly, that unconscious bias and discrimination that really has much more of a subtlety to it, and just more even an unconsciousness to it. And this was something that I found in my research, in my study, that there was so much implicit age bias that people unintentionally were portraying and bringing into their work and their attitudes. And I think that this implicit ageism is much more prominent. And I think that may be because ageism is a bit socially condoned. I believe that it's kind of almost ingrained in us from an early age, just these, subtly negative viewpoints or biases. So I think because of that, and we kind of, have that throughout the life course, it starts to permeate our culture and industries in our culture. And I think, I'll speak to ageism. I always say there's such an irony to ageism. It's the one form of discrimination that we all have the potential to be a victim of if we live long enough, which I think everyone's kind of striving to do, regardless of, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. Like, we'll all have the potential to be a victim of ageism. So I think, there's a universality to that, yet it still remains so pervasive, which I think is just such an irony there.
So I think you lightly touched on, and I would like to hear more about these industries where we're really seeing ageism present.
Yeah, I think there's so many, and I'll highlight a few. And, the media, of course, is a huge industry where we see a couple things. We see older people certainly underrepresented in television and film, or they're frequently typecast into certain, boxes or lanes. And I think that's really, a representation of visual ageism. And these typecast categories are typically things like, older people are seen as frail. They're seen as confused or having memory loss, stubborn, or a bad driver. I mean, those are like some of the common categories we see. We don't see a whole lot of positive examples of aging or positive characters, represented in the media. I think too, just some of our everyday expressions. And I think this is an example of that subtlety and that just embeddedness in our culture. Things like, having a senior moment. Like, how often do we hear that? Or do we say that phrase? And it's okay that we do. I think that we need to acknowledge it, but, having a senior moment when we forget a word or we don't remember something, and that just alludes to the fact that seniors are forgetful, or all seniors are forgetful. Not the case. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Sort of ageist. Or, how often do we hear someone being said to them, you look so good for your age.
Yes.
Meaning that like you shouldn't look good for the age that you are. So these are just like very like colloquial expressions that I think again are just so embedded in our culture. We've just like grown up and like gone through the life course hearing these things that they just become like second nature. Another place I think we see like an industry is really advertising and marketing. We see older people, sometimes they're exclusively used to market products like laxatives, hair color, assistive devices like the Life Alert buttons. And we see the ad of an older adult laying on the floor and it's like, help, I've fallen and I can't get up. I think, these are things that are certainly a part of the aging process for some people. But I think we need to change that culture of advertising, that aging is much more than just disability and decline. I also think the anti-aging culture as well. So many products and procedures. I read an article that it said 90 million Americans each year purchase products or have procedures done to combat physical aging. So we have entire industries that are like built on this. And I think it sends a message to older people that there's just great avoidance or fear or just disdain towards them and the aging process. And I'll just wrap up the industry piece with just the healthcare system. And that sort of was the overarching theme of my research. I focused on senior living, but I think, in healthcare, we see ageism just in the sheer lack of interest in pursuing geriatric medicine. That's, I think, an indication of ageism there. Sometimes healthcare professionals may be reluctant to pursue more aggressive treatments for older patients. Sometimes they're not included in their care decision-making because they're just assumed to not be able to understand or hear or be able to process that. And then I think too, sometimes, symptoms of disease or disability are just attributed to being age-related when they're really not. Things like pain or chronic fatigue, depression, and cognitive impairment too. So I think, to answer your question, there's so many, there's myriad industries where we see just this permeation of ageism in subtle and not so subtle ways.
So being in marketing, whenever I see an advertisement, more so for like clothes and for beauty, and they do include older individuals, I'm always more drawn to that brand because I know someone behind that really made a decision to be inclusive and to say that everybody is going to look a little bit different. The only way you're going to be is getting older. So let's start including more people. And my hope would be that as we start seeing more of this marketing and advertising, including across the board, more diverse individuals, that's just hopefully pushing society as a whole to start being more inclusive and accepting of these differences that we experience all day, every day.
I agree. And I love seeing that as well. And I think the tide is changing a little bit. Again, diversity across the board in all realms is critical. But I think, seeing more positive aging, advertising, marketing, that will help, I think, change that mindset and that cultural just stigma.
And Agreed. I read a book, Being Mortal, and it talks about the aging process and decision making. And that book went over something you were talking about, where there is such a lack of geriatricians and individuals studying gerontology, and people in your field, in that field, are trained of nuances to look for in their patients. For example, in the book, it gave, you always want to check an older individual's feet. And when I go to the doctor, nobody's ever asked me for that. So just these nuances, there are certain aspects of a health that we would want to be checking in an older adult that the healthcare field is a little under-equipped to serve.
Right. And again, an irony there of that, like you said, there's so few or less amount of geriatricians. However, we have so many older people now. Yes. Like, it's like, oh my gosh, like people will tell me, oh, you picked the right field, like it's going to be booming, like all of these things. Yet our healthcare system, is not, keeping up with the influx, I guess, for whatever reason. I think, maybe geriatrics isn't a pursued discipline as much as other ones. So, but it's needed. It's so critical and so fulfilling, I think, as we said in the beginning.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Would you prefer to age independently in your own home or live in a nursing facility? I know what I'd rather do. Friends Life Care membership offers just that. Plan today for a future lived at home with vitality, independence, growth, and resilience while protecting your savings. Learn about your options at a free seminar or webinar. Register at friendslifecare.org/register or call 215-628-8964. Welcome back to Honestly Aging by VigRHealth, where today I'm joined by doctoral level gerontologist Katie Reilly to discuss ageism and its impact on today's society. Katie, I want to get a little bit into the research that you did for your doctoral dissertation, and if you could share about the repercussions of ageism that you found.
Yeah. So when I was preparing my dissertation, I did a huge deep dive into the literature that had already been, previously conducted research, because I wanted to really look at what is the impact of ageism on older people, on their health and well-being. And there's so much literature that looks at physical health, things like, people who are exposed to ageism have increased risk cardiovascular events, higher risk for falls, higher stress levels. They also may engage in more risk-taking behavior, smoking, drinking, poor diet, non-compliance with meds. And also a study I found which looked at longevity and found that people with higher exposure to ageism had decreased longevity. Wow. Certainly, there's repercussions on mental and emotional health, depression, higher rates of depression and anxiety, and just overall diminished quality of life. And there was a 2022 study that I found really interesting because it's so recent, a joint study by the University of Oklahoma and University of Michigan, and they looked at the impact of everyday ageism on older adults. And I think this piece of the study was just highlighted on the CBS morning news on Sunday morning. It was a great piece. And they looked at, they polled more than 2,000 older people between the ages of 50 and 80 regarding their experiences of ageism. And at least 93% of these participants experienced one of the 10 forms of ageism. And one of the examples I'll give just briefly was that 80% agreed with the statement, health problems are a part of getting older. And then another fact of that is that 65% of the people said that they either saw, heard, or read jokes about older people that were not positive. So, certainly from this one recent study, it's certainly ageism is impactful and prevalent just in everyday life. So I think, there's certainly detrimental impact there to physical health, emotional well-being, and just the ability for someone to age well. And I think, when they're have experience with ageism, it impacts what we call self-perceptions of aging, which is another thing that I found in a lot of the research, that what older people, their self-perceptions of aging, what they internalize about their own aging process can be further impacted by surrounding culture, environment, other people. So there's a lot of detriment there. But I do think there's so much we can do to really combat ageism.
And I do want to get into how the strategies to combat ageism. But one thing I jotted down a couple of things, but one, I wrote down the word devalued, and hearing that about the work and the study that you did, it just sounded like that if these messages are being pushed out and the way that older adults are being treated, they're starting to feel devalued. So yes, their own self, it's unfortunate. It makes sense that individual self-perceptions will go down. As a result, one might start not taking as great care of oneself and turning to ways to maybe cope with how they're feeling. Mm-hmm. And then that's just a spiral. And of course you'll decline if there's a lack of care, and it just breaks my heart.
For sure. And I think it also, to your point, it also reiterates that narrative that aging is all about decline and disability, but it isn't, and it doesn't have to be. But because of things like that, we do see decline, but it could totally be eradicated or improved. So for sure. Yes.
So I'm ready. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about some strategies to combat ageism and maybe even eradicate it.
Eradication, that is what we're going for. That is the goal. That's a lofty goal, but that's part of my passion for this. And I think, it's certainly a multi-pronged approach, right? I think raising awareness. So like this podcast is so important. I'm just so happy to be here just to talk about a topic that's needed to be talked about. We need to talk about ageism. We need to acknowledge our own biases. I think in my research, and I'll talk about my study in a little bit more, I really had to look at my own age bias when I was, to bracket my own experience and really say, we all have age bias. I mean, no one, I think, is immune to that, but I think we need to acknowledge it. Where does it come from? Why do we have this feeling or thought or attitude? We need to be talking about that. And I think it's, part of that awareness is that, ageism is no longer going to be or should not be this subtlety that we kind of just accept and ignore in our culture and just kind of move on with our day. Like say it's having a senior moment and move on. Like, no, like that's not right. We shouldn't be saying things like that. I think coupled with awareness is education, of course. I think the education piece though is also multi-pronged. Certainly we want to learn more about what ageism is and its impact, but I also think we need to have proper education on aging. I think when we learn the correct information about aging, the aging process, it helps dispel ageist inaccuracies and stigma. I think so much of what contributes to ageism is just the lack of accurate knowledge about the aging process. And I think that can lead to anxiety about aging, fear of aging, and in turn, that negative stereotype, that bias, all of that stigma. So I think that is critical. Another thing, which I think Friends Life Care is embracing, is just helping to change the stigma of what it means to age. As we talked about, there's so many more cohorts of older people. It's just growing and growing, and I think it's also evolving. I think the perception of aging is also evolving, and I think we need to support older people like through organizations and efforts to just encourage them to remain active, to pursue hobbies, and also pursue new interests, to continue to work later in life if they choose. Continue educational pursuits, lifelong learning, which I know you guys are a huge proponent of, travel, embrace technology, and just lead happy and productive lives, in whatever way is meaningful for them. And I think our baby boomer cohort is truly doing that. And I think they're just embracing and changing the face of aging in positive ways. And I think cohorts, after them will continue to do the same. And I think that evolution is going to help younger generations see aging in a new light and see it hopefully more positively, and just kind of reduce those preconceived notions that, aging is just getting older, losing your memory, moving to a nursing home, and that's it. And because that's not what aging is or should be, it's, experiencing all that life has to offer. So I certainly think our baby boomer cohort is doing a fantastic job of just changing that preconceived notion of aging, and later cohorts will continue to do that too. And then one more piece, which is go ahead.
You talking about the baby boomer cohort was making me think about our solo agers who we've been doing a lot of episodes toward, and how might you think that the solo ager population is impacting ageism?
Great question and great point. And I think solo aging is such a unique and new subset of aging cohorts. And I think I just read the 2021 study that AARP published by the University of Chicago, the NORC that is there, the naturally occurring retirement community. And, they looked at the pros and cons of solo aging, and, there's cons there, for sure. And they address some of those, companionship, loneliness, future planning, but they did interview solo agers, and they asked them about, living alone. And 60% of them said that they, were aging with independence. Half of the people that they talked to were satisfied with living alone, and also were happy. So I think, this is a unique subset of aging individuals. And I think they may help change that narrative of aging even more. And that's just one study, but I think, that's going to be interesting to see how they age and, are happier and satisfied and feel independent. That's going to propel that changing of what it means to age even further.
And we were talking about solo aging and the NORCs and the village movement. In another book I was reading, it was saying that as a solo ager, you can and recommended to take steps toward finding younger friends who could help in your times of needs. So I'm just wondering, solo agers or any older adults, really, what are the benefits that we see with intergenerational connections?
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point about solo agers and younger friends, because intergenerational connection, I think, is another part of that multi-pronged approach to addressing and combating ageism. And this is something that is a huge passion of mine. As we said in the beginning, we both had grandparents and we were, growing up in good relationships. And part of my research looked at the influence of intergenerational relationships on age stereotypes and just the desire to work in senior living. And I think, and it was almost every participant that I interviewed in my study, had a positive intergenerational experience or relationship as a child growing up. And it really just influenced their desire to work in senior care, how they treated the residents, how they interacted with the residents. It was amazing. And it was very, heartwarming to hear that. But I think that intergenerational exposure can really break down stereotypes on both sides. So I think if we can try to encourage that, in my research, as some of my takeaways, I'll paraphrase and call them takeaways. I discussed how we can do that, as early as we can, in preschools and daycares, in elementary schools, just having, structured quality programming with older people can really, bring more affinity to aging, to older adults. And again, like I said, on both sides. I think a lot of the literature that I've read, that I included in my study, provided great support that early intergenerational exposure leads to positive age stereotypes and just greater respect and value of older people. So that's something that's a passion of mine. I want to do more research on that in the future. So, but I think that's a big part of how we address this, for sure.
I just will comment that I'm shocked that you're ready to do more research after you just completed your dissertation. So I commend you, and I really look up to you for that.
Thank you. I want to keep the momentum going.
I hear you. I do. So before I let you go, I just want to ask, in wrapping up, are there any messages you want to convey or items that maybe we didn't talk about or things you want to bring up again to really hit home with the listeners?
Yeah, I think, just that as I've said throughout today's podcast, there's the prevalence of ageism will only continue to increase as more and more people age. And I think, we're all going to be, God willing, older people one day. And it's really, if we think about it, discrimination against our future selves as older people. So starting a conversation on ageism is really critical and is really a small thing we can start doing. But it's really the first step, and it's a pretty pivotal step. It just there needs to be more conversation around it. And I do see that out in the world, which is so happy for me to see and hear as a gerontologist this is my passion. So I think we just need to keep, like I said, keep the momentum going on it in so many ways.
And I'm taking so many things away from this conversation, and I am taking with me your definition of ageism is discriminating against our future selves. That nails it. That really brings it home for me.
Thank you. I mean, if we think about it, And I just think, again, that irony always never ceases to amaze me, how, we'll all experience ageism, yet we continue
the cycle.
Not us, but people continue to perpetuate.
I understand, the bigger us.
Right, exactly.
Well, Katie, thank you for this comprehensive and enlightening conversation on ageism and its impact on today's society. Your research and continued work in gerontology and ageism is certainly having a positive impact on the field.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you for having me. This has been so fun, and glad to just move the topic forward as much as I can.
I feel the same. Thank you for listening to Honestly Aging by VigRHealth. You can find links and show notes from this episode on our website at friendslifecare.org/podcast. Thank you to Katie Reilly for joining us today. You can learn more about Katie on LinkedIn and Abramson Senior Care at abramsonseniorcare.org. Links to both can be found in today's show notes. If you like our show, please rate, review, subscribe, and join us next time. To learn more about aging with vitality, independence, growth, and resilience, subscribe to our blog at friendslifecare.org/blog.